I set down the carving knife, looked my son dead in the eye across a table full of 20 relatives and said 7 words that made his face go white. Then let me tell you who owns this house. For 30 years, Daniel believed he built his own empire, the car, the money, the roof over all our heads. He had just told me his 67-year-old mother to pay rent or get out, on Christmas, in front of everyone. And what he didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that every single thing he'd ever bragged about owning had my name on the deed. Before I tell you how his whole world came apart, do me one small favor. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. And if you believe a parent's love should never be taken for granted, subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end. Because what happened next changed both our lives forever. My name is Evelyn Harper, and I want to start by telling you exactly what it feels like to be humiliated by the child you gave your whole life to. It doesn't feel loud. That's the thing people get wrong. You'd think there would be some crash inside you, some breaking. But it's quiet. It's a small, cold click in your chest, like a door latching shut in a house you thought was warm. That's what I felt the night my son Daniel stood at the head of his Christmas table, the table I had set in the house I had paid for, and told me I needed to start paying rent or find somewhere else to live. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that afternoon, before the words, before the silence, before I said the thing that emptied the color from his face. I had been in that kitchen since 5 o'clock in the morning. I want you to understand something about me. I am 67 years old, and I have never in my life learned how to sit still while people I love are hungry. My mother was that way. Her mother was that way. So when Christmas came, I did what I had done for 40 years. I got up before the sun. I tied on the apron my late husband Thomas gave me the winter before he died, and I started cooking. I made the honey ham the way Daniel loved it as a boy, the one he used to sneak slices of before dinner until I'd swat his hand with a wooden spoon, and he'd laugh that big laugh he had. I made the cornbread stuffing. I made the green beans with the little onions he used to pick out and hide under the rim of his plate when he was 7. I made 2 pies pecan for the grown-ups and a sweet potato one because that was his favorite, and no matter how old that boy got, he was still my favorite reason to bake. Claire, my daughter-in-law, came into the kitchen around noon. "Evelyn, you didn't have to do all this," she said, not really looking at me, scrolling something on her phone. "We could have just ordered." "I know I didn't have to," I said. "I wanted to." "Well." She opened the refrigerator, looked inside, closed it. "Daniel's stressed today. Big week at work. So just, keep it light." "Keep it light," I repeated. "You know how he gets." I did know how he got. I'd known that boy since before he had teeth. I knew every mood he'd ever worn. And lately, for about a year, maybe more, he'd been wearing a new one, a hard, impatient thing that came down over his face whenever I was in the room, like I was a chore he kept forgetting to finish. But I said nothing. I nodded and went back to my stuffing. Because that's another thing about me you should know from the start. I am very, very good at saying nothing. I have spent a lifetime perfecting it. And that skill was about to cost my son everything he thought he owned. By 4 o'clock, the relatives started arriving. There was my sister Ruth, 70 years old and sharper than a tack, who hugged me at the door and whispered, "You look tired, Evie." There were cousins and their children, and my granddaughter Lily Daniel, and Claire's little girl, 6 years old, who ran straight into my legs and shouted, "Grandma," like I was the best thing she'd seen all year. That hug. I want you to remember that hug, because that little girl loved me plain and simple the way children do before the world teaches them to keep score. Daniel came down the stairs last the way he always did now, like he was making an entrance into his own home. He was wearing a watch I'd never seen before. Gold. Expensive. "Everybody make themselves comfortable," he announced, spreading his arms like a king. "There's plenty of room." And people laughed and admired the house, the high ceilings, the big windows, the fireplace Thomas and I had picked out tile by tile 40 years ago. "Daniel, this place is gorgeous," my cousin Margaret said. "You've done so well for yourself." "Hard work," Daniel said, and he actually winked. "Nobody handed me anything." I was standing right there, 10 feet away, holding a tray of deviled eggs. Nobody handed me anything. I felt that cold little click, the first one, right there in my chest. But I set the eggs down, and I smiled, and I said, "Who wants a plate before the ham's ready?" Because I was good at saying nothing. We sat down to dinner at 6. 22 people around a table built for 12 chairs borrowed from every room in the house, elbows bumping Lily on a stack of cushions so she could reach her plate. And it was for a while everything I had woken up at 5 in the morning to create. There was laughter. There was the clink of my mother's good silver. There was Ruth telling the story about the Christmas the turkey caught fire in 1987, and everyone groaning because they'd heard it 100 times, and me laughing anyway because I was there in 87, and it really did catch fire. For about 40 minutes, I was happy. I want to be honest with you, because I've made a promise to myself to tell this whole thing honestly. For about 40 minutes, sitting at that table, surrounded by the people I loved in the house I had built my whole life around, I let myself believe that everything was fine, that the hardness in Daniel was just stress, that Claire's coldness was just her way, that the nobody handed me anything was just a man showing off for his cousins. I let myself believe it because I wanted to. And then Daniel tapped his glass with his fork. Ting, ting, ting. The table quieted down the way tables do. People turned. Somebody shushed a child. Daniel stood up. He had that look on his face, the announcing look, the entrance look, and I felt something go tight in my stomach before he even opened his mouth. A mother knows. Before the words come, a mother knows. "I want to say something," he said, "while everybody's here." "Speech," my cousin Bill called out, and there was laughter. Daniel smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. "It's about family and responsibility." He looked around the table. "This past year's been a big one for me and Claire. Business is good. We've got Lily in a great school now. Life is good." "Amen," said Ruth, lifting her glass. "But part of being an adult," Daniel went on, "part of being a man is making the hard calls, the ones nobody wants to make." And then his eyes came to me, slow, deliberate, like a man setting something down that he'd been carrying for a long time. "Even with the people you love." The table was very quiet now. I remember Lily looking up at her father with her fork halfway to her mouth. "Mom," Daniel said. And there it was, my name, my title, Mom. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, because even then, even with that tightness in my stomach, I called him sweetheart. "You've been living here a long time," he said, "and we love having you. We do. But Claire and I have been talking, and the thing is, everybody in this house has to contribute. Everybody has responsibilities. That's just how the real world works." He paused. He actually paused like he was giving me time to appreciate his wisdom. "So going forward, if you want to keep living here, we're going to need you to start paying rent. A fair amount. Nothing crazy, but something." You could have heard a pin drop on carpet. "And look," he went on, because apparently he wasn't finished, because apparently he had rehearsed this, "if that's not something you can manage on your budget, and I understand I do, you're on a fixed income, then maybe it's time we look at other options, somewhere more suitable. There are some really nice communities for people your age. We can help you look." "Communities for people my age." He said it so gently. That was the part that took my breath. He said it like he was being generous, like he was the reasonable one, like he was a good son making a hard call, and I was the burden he was being so very kind about. 22 faces turned to look at me. I saw Ruth's mouth fall open. I saw Claire staring down at her plate, and I understood in that instant that Claire had known this was coming, that they had planned it together, that they had chosen Christmas, chosen a table full of witnesses, because they thought I'd be too proud, too polite, too old to make a scene in front of everyone. They thought the crowd would make me fold. They thought I'd nod and cry and thank them. I saw my granddaughter Lily, 6 years old, look back and forth between her father and me, not understanding the words but understanding the temperature of the room, the way children always do, and her little face started to crumple. "Grandma," she said in a small voice, "that's the moment. If you want to know the exact moment something in me changed forever, it was that. Not Daniel's cruelty, not Claire's cowardice. It was my grandbaby saying 'Grandma' in a scared little voice at a table that had gone cold, and understanding that this was the lesson her father was choosing to teach her about how you treat the people who love you. For 30 years I had kept a secret to protect that boy, to keep him humble, to let him believe he'd earned his life so he'd grow into a man worth being. I had swallowed my pride 10,000 times. I had let him call this house his house. I had let him say nobody handed me anything while I stood there holding the deviled eggs. I had told myself it was love, and maybe for a long time it was. But sitting there with Lily's frightened face in front of me, I finally understood something that took me 67 years to learn. Sometimes the thing you call love is really just fear. Fear of the truth, fear of the fight, fear of losing your child's affection so completely that you'll let him become a monster rather than risk his frown. And I decided right there with my hands flat on the tablecloth I'd ironed that morning that I was done being afraid. I did not cry. I want you to know that. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw anything, though Lord knows I thought about the sweet potato pie. I reached over, I picked up my glass of water, and I took a slow sip because I wanted the whole table to watch me be calm. I wanted Daniel to feel the silence stretch. I wanted him to start wondering in that little pause whether he'd made a mistake. I set the glass down. "All right, Daniel," I said, and my voice was steady as stone. "If that's what you believe." He blinked. That wasn't the reaction he'd braced for. He'd braced for tears, for an argument for me to beg. He had not braced for calm. "Mom, I'm not trying to—" No, I said gently. "You've made yourself very clear. Everybody contributes. Everybody has responsibilities. That's how the real world works." I folded my napkin and laid it beside my plate, slow and neat. "You're right. It is time you learned how the real world works." "Evelyn," Claire started. "We didn't mean—" "Then maybe," I said, and now I looked at my son straight at him the way I used to look at him when he was small and had done something he knew was wrong. "It's time you learned who actually owns this house." Silence. Daniel's smile, that entrance smile, that king of the castle smile, it just slid right off his face. I watched it go. I watched something flicker behind his eyes, some first small doubt. "What are you talking about?" he said, but it came out quieter than he meant it to. "You heard me. Mom, this is my house. I bought this." "Did you?" I said. "Did you buy it, Daniel? Do you remember buying it? Do you remember signing the papers? Do you remember sitting across from the loan officer? Or do you remember your mother handing you a set of keys and telling you not to worry about the details?" His jaw worked. He didn't answer because he couldn't answer because we both knew he had never sat across from any loan officer in his life. 12 years ago, I said to the whole table now, because they were all listening, every single one of them. My son told me he'd found a beautiful house he wanted to buy for his new family. And I said, "That's wonderful, Daniel." And I made it happen. Every dollar, every signature, every arrangement. And I asked for only one thing in return. I looked at him. I asked that you never have to feel like it was handed to you. I wanted you to feel like a man who'd earned it, so I let you believe you had. "That's not—" Daniel's voice cracked. "That's not true." "The car in the driveway," I said. "The one you drove up in tonight, whose name is on that. It's mine." "Whose name, Daniel, if you're so sure? Tell the table whose name is on the title." He opened his mouth. He closed it. Ruth made a small sound, her hand over her mouth. Margaret was staring at me like she'd never seen me before in her life. "You want to talk about responsibilities," I said, and for the first time a little heat came into my voice, just a little because I'm human, and there is only so much a heart can hold. "You want to stand up in front of your whole family on Christmas and lecture your mother about the real world, about how everybody contributes, about how nobody handed you anything." I stood up, 67 years old, and my knees don't work the way they used to, but I stood up straight. "Son, I have handed you everything you have ever touched. The house you're standing in, the car you're so proud of, the school your daughter goes to, the suit you're wearing. And I did it quietly, and I did it gladly, and I never once asked for a word of thanks because I thought I was raising a good man. Mom?" His voice was different now, small, young. For one second he sounded like the boy who used to sneak the honey ham. "But a good man," I said, "does not tell his mother to pay rent or leave. Not on Christmas, not ever." The room was dead silent. Somewhere in it Lily had started to cry, quiet little hiccups, and Ruth had pulled the child gently onto her lap. Daniel just stood there, and I watched the truth start to land on him piece by piece the way water finds every crack in a foundation. I could see him doing the math, the house, the car, the accounts, the loans over the years that never seemed to need repaying, every convenient thing that had always just worked out for him, every problem that had quietly, invisibly disappeared. Me. It had always been me. "How," he swallowed. "How much do you—" He couldn't even finish it. He couldn't ask his own mother how rich she was standing in the ruins of the lecture he'd just given. That, I said, is a conversation we're going to have, but not tonight. Tonight you're going to sit down and you're going to finish the dinner. I got up at 5 in the morning to cook, and tomorrow, I picked up my folded napkin, and I set it on my empty chair, a small period at the end of a very long sentence. Tomorrow you'll get a letter, and then we'll see how the real world works. I did not storm out. I want you to know that too. Storming out is for people who lost. I had not lost. I walked around the table slow, and I bent down and I kissed my granddaughter Lily on the top of her head, and I whispered, "It's all right, baby. Grandma's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." And then I picked up my coat from the back of my chair, and I walked to the front door of the house that everyone in that room now understood was mine, and I let myself out into the cold. Behind me I heard the table erupt. I heard Ruth's voice rise. I heard Claire say Daniel's name sharp. I heard chairs scraping. I heard my son say, "Mom, Mom, wait." But I didn't wait. I got in my old car, my actual car, the 15-year-old sedan I drove, because I never cared about impressing anyone, and I sat there for a moment in the dark with my hands shaking on the wheel. Because here's the truth I didn't say out loud at the table. Underneath the calm, underneath the stone, my heart was breaking clean in half. That was still my baby in there. The boy who used to fall asleep on my chest. The boy I worked 2 jobs for. The boy I built a whole life around so quietly that he grew up thinking he'd built it himself. I had just blown up his entire world. And even though he deserved it, even though every word I said was true, a part of me wanted to run back inside and tell him it was all a mistake, that I'd keep paying, keep quiet, keep smiling. Just please, please don't look at me the way he'd looked at me when the truth landed. But I didn't. I turned the key. And I want to tell you why, because this is the heart of the whole thing. 30 years ago, I made myself a promise. When my husband Thomas died and left me alone with a little boy and nothing but debt, I promised that child would never feel poor, never feel less than, never feel the cold I grew up in. And I kept that promise so well for so long that I accidentally raised a man who had never once in his life felt the ground shake beneath his feet, who thought comfort was his birthright, who thought his mother was a burden because he had never, not for one single day, understood what it cost to keep him comfortable. And you cannot love a person into being grateful. I learned that at that Christmas table. You cannot sacrifice someone into character. Sometimes the most loving thing a mother can do, the hardest, cruelest looking, most loving thing, is to finally let her child fall. So I drove away from that house, and behind me the lights were blazing in every window, and my son was standing somewhere inside it, learning for the very first time in his charmed and easy life that the floor he was standing on had always belonged to me. I checked into a hotel that night, 67 years old on Christmas in a hotel, because I could not sleep another night under a roof where my own son thought I was a tenant he could evict. And I sat on the edge of that stiff hotel bed and I finally let myself cry. Not at the table, not in the car, there alone where no one could use my tears against me. I cried for the boy he used to be. I cried for the man he'd become. I cried for Thomas, who never got to see any of it, who I was glad, God forgive me, I was glad wasn't there to hear his son say those words. And then I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I picked up the phone and I called Harold Weiss, my attorney for 30 years, the only man alive besides my accountant who knew exactly what Evelyn Harper was worth. He answered on the 4th ring, sleepy. "Evelyn, it's Christmas night. Is everything all right?" "No, Harold," I said. "It isn't, but it's going to be." There was a pause. He'd known me a long time. He knew that tone. "What do you need?" he said. And I looked out the window of that hotel at the cold, dark city, at all the warm-lit windows of all the families I hoped were kinder than mine had turned out to be, and I said, "I need you to draw up some letters." I could hear him sit up in bed. I could hear him reach for the pad he keeps on his nightstand, the one he's kept for 30 years, ever since I was a young widow with a construction supply company the size of a shoebox and a dream I told nobody about. "Talk to me," Harold said. So I did. I told him everything that had happened at the table, the rent, the communities for people your age, the nobody handed me anything. I told him about Lily's frightened little face, and I told him the thing I had decided as I sat there with my hands flat on my own tablecloth. "I've protected him his whole life," I said. "I protected him right out of his own character, Harold. I've raised a man who doesn't know the value of a single thing he has because I made sure he never had to find out. And that ends now, not out of spite." I closed my eyes. Out of love, the real kind, the kind I should have had the courage for years ago. Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said softly, "You know that once I send these, there's no unsending them. This is going to hurt him, Evelyn, badly." "I know." and it's going to hurt you worse. I opened my eyes. Out in the dark, one by one, the warm windows were going out as families finally slept. I know that too, I said. But Harold, a burn heals. You know what doesn't heal? A man who goes to his own mother's funeral someday, still thinking he never needed her, still thinking he did it all himself. I'd rather he hate me for a year and understand me for the rest of his life. I heard Harold's pen scratching, and then he said the thing that has stayed with me ever since, the thing I want to leave you with tonight, before I tell you what those letters did when they landed the next morning. He said, "You know what your problem always was, Evelyn. You built an empire and you spent 30 years hiding it, and you called that love. But love that hides isn't the same as love that protects. Maybe it's time your son found out what his mother's really made of." I held that phone to my ear in the dark in a hotel on Christmas, with my whole heart in pieces on the floor, and I said the truest thing I've ever said in my life. "Send the letters, Harold, all of them, first thing in the morning." The letters went out at 9 o'clock the next morning. I know the exact time because Harold called me the moment his courier confirmed delivery, and I was still sitting in that hotel room staring at a cup of coffee I hadn't touched, wearing yesterday's Christmas clothes because I hadn't packed a single thing when I walked out of that house. "They're delivered," Harold said. "All 3, signed for." Signed for by who? Claire, according to the courier. I closed my eyes. So Claire opened them first. Of course she did. That woman had a nose for trouble like a bloodhound, and she'd have known the second she saw the return address that the storm had arrived. "Evelyn," Harold said carefully, "your phone is about to start ringing. You understand that?" "I understand. You don't have to answer it." "I know I don't. But I did answer it. Because 38 minutes later, when Daniel's name lit up my screen, I couldn't help myself. A mother is a mother, even when her heart is in pieces, especially then. "Hello, Daniel." "Mom." His voice was shaking. Not angry yet. That would come. Right then it was pure confusion, the sound of a man who'd woken up in a world that had rearranged itself while he slept. "Mom, what is this?" "There's a letter here from a property management company saying the lease on the house is terminated, effective in 90 days. What lease? We don't have a lease. This is our house." "Read the letterhead, sweetheart." "I'm looking at it. Harper Holdings Property Management." "Mom, what is Harper Holdings?" And there it was. 12 years he'd lived in that house, and he'd never once wondered why the property taxes never seemed to come to him, why the maintenance was always handled, why every bill that should have crossed his desk somehow never did. He'd never questioned it. Comfortable people don't question comfort. They just breathe it in like air and call it their due. "Harper Holdings," I said, "is my company, Daniel. It's been my company for 30 years, and that house you're standing in is one of its properties. So is the house your cousin Margaret rents, incidentally, though that's neither here nor there." Silence on the line. I could hear him breathing. "The second letter," I went on because I wasn't going to make him ask, "is from the dealership. The lease authorization on the car is being withdrawn. You'll want to make other arrangements before the end of the month." "The third one's from the bank." There were 3 accounts that had a certain cushion in them. A cushion you may have noticed never seemed to run dry, no matter how much you and Claire spent. Those accounts were funded through a trust. I've closed the funding. "You can't do that." Now the anger came, right on schedule. "You can't just, Mom, we have a mortgage. We have Lily's tuition. You can't just pull everything out from under us on Christmas." "I didn't pull anything out from under you," I said, and my voice stayed level, even as my hand tightened on the phone. "There was never a mortgage, Daniel. You never had a mortgage. There was me, and I'm not pulling anything out from under you. I'm removing myself from under you. There's a difference, though. I understand you've never had to learn it." "This is insane. This is you're doing this out of spite, because of what I said last night." "What you said last night," I repeated slowly. "You mean when you told your 67-year-old mother to pay rent or move into a home for old people, in front of your daughter, on Christmas. That thing you said last night." He didn't answer. "No, Daniel, I'm not doing this out of spite. Spite would be easy. Spite would feel good, and God knows I could use something that felt good this morning. I'm doing this because last night you taught me something. You stood up and you told me how the real world works. And you were right. I've been keeping you out of the real world for 40 years, and it made you into someone I don't recognize. So I'm letting you in. Welcome. It's cold out here. You'll get used to it." And I hung up. I want you to know it's the first time in my life I ever hung up on my son, and my hands were trembling so hard afterward that I spilled the cold coffee all down my Christmas dress. But I did it. The phone rang again immediately. I let it ring. It rang 11 more times over the next hour, and I let it ring every time, and each ring was a small knife, and I sat there and let each one go in. By noon, Ruth called, my sister, and her I answered. "Evie," she said, "Lord in heaven, are you all right? I've been up all night. The whole family's been up all night. Do you know what you did to that table?" "I know exactly what I did to that table, Ruth." "Margaret's beside herself. Bill won't stop calling everyone. And Daniel," she lowered her voice, "Evie, Daniel came apart after you left. I've never seen anything like it. He just kept saying it couldn't be true over and over, and Claire was screaming at him about the accounts and that poor baby Lily crying in the corner. It was a nightmare. It was an absolute nightmare." "Good," I said. "Evie, I mean it, Ruth. Good. Let it be a nightmare. He gave me a nightmare first, and he did it on purpose, and he did it in front of my grandbaby. I have spent 30 years making sure that boy never had one single nightmare, and look what it got me." Ruth was quiet a moment. Then she said the thing sisters say. "You know I'm on your side. You know that. But Evie, is this really the way, cutting him off entire? He's still your son." "He's still my son," I agreed. "That's exactly why I'm doing it. You cut off a stranger to punish him. You cut off your son to save him." I paused. "Ruth, do you remember what Mama used to say about the peach tree in the backyard?" "Evie, don't. She said a tree that's never known a hard winter grows soft wood, grows fast and pretty and tall, and then the first real storm comes and snaps it clean in half because it never had a reason to grow strong. That's my Daniel. I gave him 30 years of summer. I never let one winter touch him. And I turned him into softwood, Ruth. I did that. Nobody else. And I'm not going to stand here and watch the first real storm of his life snap him in half because I was too much of a coward to let him feel a little cold while he still had the chance to grow strong." My sister was crying on the other end of the line. I could hear it. "When did you get so wise?" she said finally, "and so hard all at the same time?" "Christmas night," I said, "about 6:15. I stayed in that hotel for 4 days. 4 days, and the phone never stopped. Daniel called 40 times. Claire called too, and hers were worse because Claire didn't beg. Claire negotiated. Claire left voicemails in that smooth, reasonable voice explaining why I was overreacting, why we could all sit down like adults, why there was no need to do anything drastic, why I should think about Lily. Always Lily. Claire had figured out fast that the fastest road to my heart ran straight through that little girl, and she wasn't wrong, and I hated her a little for how right she was. On the 4th day, I checked out. I drove not to the big house, I couldn't go there, not yet, but to my actual home, the one nobody in the family had ever seen. Because here's something else Daniel never knew. I didn't live in that big house because I loved it. I lived there because he needed a mother close, and I let him believe I couldn't afford my own place. The truth was, I owned a quiet little house across town paid for in cash a decade ago with a garden and a reading chair, and not one single person in it who thought I was a burden. That's where I went. That's where I finally slept. And that's where Daniel found me 9 days later. I heard the car in the driveway before I heard the knock. Through the window I saw it wasn't the fancy car anymore. It was a rental, a cheap little economy thing, and my son climbed out of it looking like he hadn't slept in a week, and I felt that old traitor of a heart lurch toward the door before my head could stop it. He knocked. I opened it. "How did you find this place?" I said. "Harold told me." He looked terrible, unshaven gray under the eyes, wearing a sweater I recognized from years ago because the new clothes, I suppose, weren't coming anymore. "Can I come in?" I stood in the doorway a long moment. Every cell in my body wanted to pull him inside and feed him and fix it. That's the thing nobody tells you about being a mother. The love doesn't switch off just because the child broke your heart. If anything, it gets louder, more desperate, right when you most need it to be quiet. "You can come in," I said, "but you're going to sit down, and you're going to listen, and you're not going to negotiate because I'm not Claire, and this isn't a deal." He flinched at that, but he came in. I sat him at my little kitchen table, the one he'd never seen in the house, he'd never known existed, and I poured him coffee because 40 years of habit doesn't die in 9 days, and I sat across from him and waited. "I lost the car 3 days ago," he said finally, staring into the cup. "Claire's furious. The tuition payment bounced. Lily's school called. It was..." His voice broke. Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to have your daughter's school call you about a bounce tuition check? Yes, I said. As a matter of fact, I do. It happened to me in 1991. You were 4. The daycare I'd scraped to afford called me at the factory to tell me my check bounced, and my supervisor stood there listening to every word, and then he docked me an hour's pay for taking a personal call. So yes, Daniel, I know exactly how it feels. He looked up at me. You never told me that, he said. I never told you a lot of things. That was the whole problem, wasn't it? I built you a life with no hard parts in it, and then I acted surprised when you grew up not knowing hard parts existed. He was quiet. Then he said, Mom, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry about Christmas. I shouldn't have said it like that in front of everybody. It was... Stop! I held up my hand. Stop right there, because you just did the thing again and I want you to hear yourself do it. You said you're sorry about how you said it, in front of everybody. You're not sorry you think it. You're sorry you got caught thinking it in a room full of witnesses. I leaned forward. Am I wrong? His mouth opened, closed, and I watched the honest answer move across his face before he could hide it, and the honest answer was that I wasn't wrong at all. That's what I thought, I said, and I sat back. He put his face in his hands, and for a moment I thought he was going to cry, and part of me wanted him to, and part of me was terrified he would, because I did not know if I had the strength to sit still through my son crying at my kitchen table. But he didn't cry. He just breathed hard into his own hands, and when he took them away, his eyes were red but dry. I don't understand how you did it, he said. Any of it. The company, the money, all these years. How did I not know? How did I live in your house and drive your car? And I never even... He shook his head. Who are you? I feel like I don't even know who my own mother is. And that right there was the first true thing he'd said to me in about 10 years. I don't even know who my own mother is. He was right. He didn't. Nobody did. That was the cost of what I'd done. I'd made myself invisible so thoroughly that my own child couldn't see me. So I decided to let him see. Sit back, I told him. I'm going to tell you a story, and you're going to listen to the whole thing, and you're not going to interrupt, because you've had 30 years of the ending, and you've never once heard the beginning. He sat back. Your father died, I began, when you were 11 months old. Daniel went very still. He knew Thomas had died young. He'd never known the details because I'd never given them, because every time the subject came up when he was a boy, I changed it, and by the time he was a man, he'd stopped asking. He died on a Tuesday, I said. A scaffolding collapse at a job site. He was a foreman, good one. The company he worked for settled with me for $11,000 and told me I was lucky to get it. $11,000, Daniel, for the man I loved, and a baby, and a stack of medical bills from the 2 days he lingered in the hospital before he passed, because he didn't die right away. He died slow, and I was there for every hour of it, holding his hand while you slept in a car seat on the floor of the ICU, because I had nobody to leave you with. Daniel's hand had come up to his mouth. I had a high school diploma and no money and a baby and a dead husband, I said. And I made a decision in that hospital the night he died that you were never going to feel what I was feeling. Never. I stood over your crib that night, and I promised your father out loud that his son would never know how it felt to have the floor drop out, that you'd always be safe, always be warm, always have enough. I looked at him. I kept that promise, Daniel. God help me, I kept it too well. Mom, don't interrupt. I told you not to interrupt. He closed his mouth. I took Thomas's $11,000, I said, and I didn't spend it. I studied it. I read every book in the library on business, on construction, on contracts at night after you were asleep, after I'd worked a full shift at the cannery. I'd learned enough from your father's work to know the trade. I knew that every construction crew in the county was buying supplies at a markup from suppliers 2 counties over. I knew there was a gap, and I took $11,000 and I filled it. I told him about the first year working out of a rented storage unit delivering lumber and fasteners out of the back of a truck I bought for $400, with him strapped into a car seat in the cab, because I couldn't afford childcare and wouldn't have used it anyway. I told him about the crews who wouldn't buy from a woman who called me sweetheart and honey and asked to speak to the owner, and how I'd smile and say you're speaking to her and watch their faces. I told him about the nights I did the books until 2 in the morning and got up at 5 to open, and how I'd stopped being tired somewhere around 1994 because tired was a luxury I couldn't afford. By the time you were in the 3rd grade, I said I had 4 employees and 2 trucks. By the time you were in high school, I had a warehouse and a contract with the county. And you never knew because I made sure you never knew. I drove the old car. I wore the old coats. I told you we had to be careful with money. Do you remember that? I told you we had to be careful, and I made you clip coupons with me on Sundays. And the whole time there was more in the bank than you'll ever spend, because I wanted you to grow up understanding the value of $1. Daniel made a sound, half a laugh, but there was no humor in it. You wanted me to understand the value of $1, he repeated. Mom, I said that exact thing to a client last month, word for word. I told him I understood the value of $1. He put his head down. I've never understood the value of anything. You made sure of it. You clipped coupons to teach me a lesson, and then you paid for my entire life in secret, so I never actually learned it. And do you know that stopped me cold? Because he was right. He was exactly right, and it was the smartest thing my son had ever said to me, and it had taken losing everything for him to say it. Yes, I said quietly. That's exactly what I did. I taught you the words and I hid the meaning. I gave you the vocabulary of a struggle you never had. And I'm not telling you this story so you'll feel sorry for me, Daniel. Your father's been gone 30 years, and I made my peace with it a long time ago. I'm telling you because you asked who your mother is, and I've decided you deserve to know finally, before it's too late for it to matter. I was crying now, openly. My grown son at my kitchen table in a sweater from years ago, crying into his coffee, and I sat on my hands under the table, because if I reached for him I would fold, and I could not fold, not yet. When you graduated college, I made myself go on. You called me and told me you'd found a job. You were so proud. Do you remember marketing associate at Bellwether Group? $41,000 a year, and you thought you'd conquered the world. I paused. Daniel, who owns Bellwether Group? He went still, so still. No, he said. A holding company owns it, I said, and that holding company is a subsidiary of Harper Holdings. I bought Bellwether Group 8 months before you applied. When your resume crossed the hiring manager's desk, he called me because I'd told him to, and I said hire him, but never tell him, treat him like anyone else. And if he's good, promote him, and if he's not, don't. I watched my son's face come apart. You were good, by the way. You were genuinely good at the job. That was real. The promotions were real. But the ladder, Daniel, the ladder was mine. I owned the whole building you were climbing. He stood up so fast the chair fell over. Everything. His voice cracked down the middle. You're telling me everything, my job, my career, the thing I built, the thing I've been standing up at family dinners, bragging about that I did it all myself. Nobody handed me anything. I was pacing my little kitchen 6 feet one way, 6 feet back. That was you too. All of it. There's nothing in my whole life that was actually mine. Your character was yours, I said. That's the one thing I couldn't buy for you, and that's the one thing that came out rotten. I stood up too. So no, not everything. The one thing that was truly, purely yours, how you treat the people who love you, you built that all by yourself. And on Christmas night, you showed the whole family exactly what you made. He stopped pacing. He stood in the middle of my kitchen, and he looked at me, and there was something new in his face now. Something underneath the shock and the anger, and it took me a moment to recognize it, because I hadn't seen it on my son in a very long time. It was shame, real shame. Not the shame of getting caught, the deeper kind, the kind that changes people if it doesn't destroy them first. Why are you telling me all this now? He whispered. Why not just let me apologize, let me pay the rent, let it go back to normal? Why blow up my whole life to prove a point? And this was the question. This was the whole thing right here, and I'd been waiting 9 days to answer it. Because there is no normal to go back to, I said. Normal was the sickness Daniel. Normal was a 40-year-old man who thought he'd earned a life his mother built brick by brick in secret. Normal was you standing over your own daughter, teaching her by example that the people who sacrifice for you are people you get to evict when they become inconvenient. That's what Lily saw on Christmas. Did you think about that? She's 6. She was watching. She was learning how a man treats his mother. And what you taught her is that love is something you throw away when you think you don't need it anymore. Daniel sat back down, slowly, like his legs had stopped working. I don't want that for her, I said. I don't want her to grow up and do to you what you did to me. And she will, Daniel. That's how it works. Children don't do what you tell them. They do what they see. She'll grow up watching how you treat me, and someday when you're 67, she'll treat you the exact same way, and you'll stand in a room full of family with your heart in pieces, and you'll finally understand, and it'll be too late. Unless somebody breaks it. And I'm the only one left who can. The kitchen was silent. Outside a car passed. Somewhere a dog barked. And my son sat at my table with his whole invented life lying in ruins around him, and I stood there having just told him the truest and hardest thing I'd ever said to anyone. "So here's what's going to happen," I said, and I sat back down across from him and folded my hands. "Nothing. That's what's going to happen. I'm not going to fix it. The house lease ends in 90 days. The car is gone. The accounts are closed. Lily's tuition. And here I did allow myself one mercy because I am not made of stone. Lily's tuition. I'll cover directly to the school because that child did nothing wrong, and I won't punish her for your sins. But that's the only thread I'm leaving. Everything else you're going to have to build, for real this time, with your own 2 hands, the way I did." "I don't know how," he said, and it came out small and honest and afraid. "Mom, I'm 40 years old and I genuinely don't know how. I don't even know where to start." "I know you don't," I said. "That's the saddest part of this whole thing, and it's my fault and I'm sorry for it truly. But being sorry doesn't fix it. Only the winter fixes it now." He looked at me for a long time, and then he asked the question. I'll never forget the question that told me there was still something down in there worth saving. "Are you going to be around?" he said, while I figure it out. "Are you going to be in my life, or is this goodbye?" And oh, that broke me. That nearly broke me clean. Because underneath the man who'd told me to pay rent there was still a little boy who was afraid his mother was leaving. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, and my voice finally cracked, the first crack I'd allowed since Christmas. "You hear me? I am your mother. I will be your mother until the day I die and every day after. I'm not leaving you, Daniel. I'm just stepping back. There's a difference. I spent 30 years standing in front of you blocking every hard wind. I'm not walking away. I'm just stepping to the side, so the wind can finally reach you, and so I can watch what you do when it does." He put his head down on my kitchen table on his folded arms, the way he used to when he was a little boy, and the day had been too big for him. And this one time, I let myself reach across and put my hand on the back of his head, on his hair that was starting to go gray at the edges. My baby, my boy, my heartbreak, and I held it there while his shoulders shook. "It's all right," I whispered. "It's all right. This is the beginning, not the end. You'll see." He stayed for an hour, and when he left, he stopped at the door, and he turned around and he said, "Mom, what you built, Harper Holdings, 30 years from $11,000. He shook his head slowly. "I spent my whole life bragging about being self-made, and I was never anything close to it, and you actually did it, and you never said one word." "No," I said, "I never did." "Why not? All those times I sat there talking about my hard work, my success. Nobody handed me anything. You could have put me in my place any second. Why did you let me?" And I gave him the truest answer I had. "Because I loved you more than I loved being right," I said. "For 40 years I loved you more than I loved being right. And that was my mistake, son. Because a mother who loves you more than the truth isn't loving you. She's just afraid of you. And I'm done being afraid of you, Daniel. That's the real gift I'm giving you this Christmas. For the first time in your life, your mother's going to tell you the truth, even when it costs her everything." He looked at me, and then he did something he hadn't done since he was a teenager. He crossed the room and he put his arms around me and he held on. Not the loose Christmas card hug of a man who thinks he's doing you a favor. The other kind. The kind where a person is holding on because they're afraid of falling. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered into my shoulder. "I know you can," I said, "because I made you. And whatever else I got wrong, I know exactly what I put into you. It's in there. It's just never had a reason to come out." He left. I watched the cheap little rental car back out of my driveway and disappear down the street, and I stood in my doorway until the sound of the engine was long gone, and then I went inside, and I sat down at the table where my son had just wept, and I finally let myself fall apart completely. Because being strong for someone you love is one thing, but nobody tells you the price of it. Nobody tells you that the mother holding it all together is holding it alone, and that when the door finally closes, there's no one left to hold her. I sat in that kitchen a long time, and then I did the last thing I'd planned for that day. I picked up the phone and I called Harold one more time. "It's done," I told him. I told him everything. How did he take it? I looked out the window at the empty driveway at the cold, gray afternoon settling over my quiet little street. "Like a man who just found out his whole life was a lie," I said, "which it was." Harold was quiet a moment. Then he said, "You did a hard thing today, Evelyn." "I did a necessary thing." "Both can be true." He paused. "What now?" And I thought about my son driving back to a house he had 90 days left in, to a wife who was already looking for the exit, to a life that had just been stripped down to the studs. I thought about the winter I'd finally deliberately let into his life after protecting him from it for 40 years. And I thought about the only question that actually mattered, the one I couldn't answer yet, the one that would take everything that came next to answer. "Now," I said, "we find out what he's really made of." What he was made of, it turned out, was not much, at least not at first. The first thing that broke was the marriage. I'd known it was coming. You don't watch a woman like Claire for 12 years without learning to read her. But I didn't expect it to come so fast or so ugly. It was 3 weeks after the day Daniel wept at my kitchen table. He called me on a Thursday night, and I could tell before he said a word that something had cracked all the way through. "She's leaving," he said. "No hello, just that. Claire, she's taking Lily and she's going to her mother's in Arizona." I sat down slowly. "When did she tell you this?" "An hour ago. She's upstairs packing right now. She said—" His voice went thin. "She said she didn't sign up for this. She said she married a man who was going places, and she wasn't going to stand around and watch him turn back into nothing. She said, and here he had to stop, and I heard him breathe. And when he started again, his voice was somewhere I'd never heard it, somewhere down at the bottom of a man. She said, 'Your mother took everything, and I'm not going to sit here and be poor while you figure out how to be a man.'" I closed my eyes. I had done this. Some part of it I had done this, and I would carry that. "Daniel, don't," he said. "Don't tell me it's for the best. Don't tell me she was never good for me. I know you never liked her. Just please don't say it." "I wasn't going to say any of that," I said quietly. "I was going to say I'm sorry. And I am. I'm sorry, son. Whatever else is between us, no man should lose his family 3 weeks before Christmas is even done being over. I'm sorry." I didn't say anything for a long moment, and then, so quiet I almost missed it, he said, "Is this my fault or yours?" And wasn't that the question? Wasn't that the whole thing laid bare on a Thursday night? "Both," I said, because he'd earned the truth, and I'd promised him nothing but the truth from here on out. "It's both, Daniel. I built a life so soft that the first hard thing snapped it. That's mine. But the man Claire's leaving, the one who thought comfort was love, who married a woman for where he thought he was going, that man you built. So it's both. And the only thing that matters now is what you do with the pieces." "There's a child in this," he said. "Lily. She's taking Lily to Arizona, Mom. I'm going to be one of those fathers who sees his kid on a screen, on a weekend. I did that too. I built that too." I gripped the phone, because that one hurt. That one landed on me, and I felt it because Lily was mine too, in all the ways that count, and the thought of that baby 2,000 miles away put a stone in my chest. "You fight for her," I said. "You hear me? Whatever else falls apart, you fight for time with that little girl. Not with money. You don't have money anymore, and that's the point. You fight with showing up, with being someone she can count on. That costs nothing, and it's worth everything, and it's the one thing I can't do for you, and the one thing that'll matter most." Claire and Lily left on a Sunday. Daniel drove them to the airport in the cheap rental because it was the only car he had, and he told me later it was the longest drive of his life. His wife not speaking to him in the front seat, his daughter asking from the back why Daddy wasn't coming to Grandma Susan's, and Daniel not having a single answer that a 6-year-old could understand. He said Lily cried at the security line. He said she reached back over Claire's shoulder with both arms out calling for him, and a stranger had to help Claire carry her through because she wouldn't stop reaching. He said he sat in the airport parking garage for 2 hours after their plane took off in a car that wasn't even his, and he couldn't make himself turn the key. "That's the first time in my life," he told me that night, "that I couldn't buy my way out of a feeling. There was nothing to spend, nothing to fix it with. I just had to sit there and feel it. Do you know, I've never done that before, 40 years old, and I'd never once just sat in a feeling with nothing to make it stop." "Welcome to the winter," I said softly, and I meant it kind, not cruel. That's what it is. That's all it ever was. Feeling things with nothing to make them stop. The house went next. 90 days is not a long time when you have nowhere to go and no money to go there with. Daniel spent the first month of it in denial, I think waiting for me to change my mind, waiting for Claire to change hers, waiting for the universe to reset itself back to the way it had always been. But the universe doesn't reset, And on day 62, he called and told me he'd found an apartment. "It's small," he said, and there was something in his voice I couldn't place at first. It took me a moment to recognize it because I hadn't heard it from him in so long. It was pride, small and battered and real. "It's 1 bedroom. It's over a laundromat, so it's warm, which the guy said is a plus, and I guess it is. It's $410 a month. I signed the lease myself. I filled out the application myself. I gave them a deposit out of money I actually earned." "Earned how?" I asked, because I hadn't given him a dime, and I'd made sure the family knew not to either. And here he paused. And then he told me, and I had to put my hand over my mouth so he wouldn't hear the sound I made. "I got a job," he said, "at a hardware store. Sanderson's over on 5th. I'm stocking shelves and cutting keys and mixing paint. $9 an hour." A breath. "Mom, I have a marketing degree and 18 years of experience, and I'm mixing paint at a hardware store for $9 an hour, and it's the first honest paycheck I've earned in my entire life, because every other one came from a building you owned." I couldn't speak. I genuinely could not speak. "You still there?" he said. "I'm here," I managed. "I'm proud of you, Daniel." "Don't be proud yet," he said, and there was something almost like a laugh in it, dark and tired but real. "I'm terrible at it. I broke the key machine on my first day. I mixed a gallon of paint the wrong color, and the manager took it out of my check. I'm the oldest guy there by 15 years, and the kids all think I'm some sad case who lost everything, which I mean, they're not wrong." The laugh faded. "But I show up. I show up every day at 6 a.m., and I show up on time, and I don't complain. And yesterday, the manager, Ray, he told me I was the only one there he never has to worry about. That's the first thing I've been told in a year that I actually believe I earned. I want to tell you that from there it got easier for him. It didn't. This is the part of the story people always want to rush through, the part where the lesson is learned and the man is redeemed and everything comes up roses. But that's not how winter works. Winter is long. Winter is 100 small, cold mornings in a row, and it doesn't care that you've had your realization. It just keeps being cold. He struggled. He struggled hard. There was the night he called me at 11 o'clock, and I could hear he'd been drinking, which he never did, and he said, "I found the pictures." And I said, "What pictures?" And he said, "Of the house, the old listing, when I bought it. There's a picture of me standing in front of it with the keys, grinning like an idiot." And I remember that day, Mom. I remember feeling like the king of the world. I remember calling my buddies and telling them I'd made it. And it was all fake. Every second of it was fake, and I didn't know. His voice broke. "How do I trust anything I remember? How do I know which parts of my life were real?" And I sat up in bed at 11 o'clock at night, and I talked my 40-year-old son down from the worst night of his life. And I did not hang up until I heard him promise me he'd go to sleep, and I did not sleep myself until the sun came up. There was the week Lily got sick in Arizona. Nothing serious, a bad flu, but she was 2,000 miles away and asking for her daddy. And Daniel had $11 in his checking account and couldn't buy a plane ticket. And he called me not to ask for money, but just because he had no one else to tell. And he said, "My little girl is sick and wants me and I can't get to her. And a year ago I'd have been on a private..." He stopped. "I used to charter planes, Mom, for weekend trips. I chartered a plane once to take Claire to wine country for her birthday. And now my daughter is sick and I can't afford a coach seat. I could have bought him the ticket. My finger was over the phone the whole time ready to, and I want you to understand how hard it was not to. But I didn't, because a plane ticket bought by me would have taught him the old lesson, the lesson that Mom fixes everything, and that lesson had already cost him his marriage and his character, and very nearly his soul. So instead I said, 'What are you going to do about it?' And there was a long silence. And then my son said, 'I'm going to pick up weekend shifts. Ray's been asking. I'm going to work every Saturday and Sunday for a month, and I'm going to save it, and I'm going to buy my own ticket so that the next time she's sick, I can get to her, and it'll be my money that does it. That's what I'm going to do.' And he did. It took him 5 weeks. And when he finally flew to Arizona and stood at Grandma Susan's door, and Lily ran into his arms, he told me it was the best money he'd ever spent in his life, and it was $91, and I understood then that something in my son was actually changing. Not because he said the right words. He'd always been good at the right words. It was changing because for the first time the words were costing him something to say. The family didn't make it easy on him either. I want to be honest about that because families never do. Word had gotten around the way it does. 22 people at that Christmas table, and every one of them had a phone, and by February, the whole extended family knew that Daniel Harper had fallen off his high horse and landed in a one-bedroom over a laundromat. And people are people. Some were kind. My sister Ruth drove over to his apartment with a crock pot of stew and pretended she'd just made too much. But some were not kind. Some of them remembered every time Daniel had bragged, nobody handed me anything, every subtle little way he'd made them feel small at family gatherings when he was riding high. And now that he was down, they came around to enjoy it. His cousin Bill was the worst of them. Bill called Daniel up, I heard about this later, and under the guise of checking in spent 20 minutes needling him. "So how's the hardware store you cutting keys now, man? And you used to lecture me about my landscaping business. Remember that? You told me I lacked vision. That's rich now, isn't it? That's real rich." Daniel told me about it that night, and I braced myself for the old Daniel, the wounded pride, the lashing out. But that's not what came. "You know what I told him," Daniel said. "I told him he was right. I told him I did lecture him and I had no business doing it and I was sorry. And Bill didn't know what to do with that. He was all wound up to fight and I just agreed with him. And you know what he did? He got quiet and then he said, 'Well, okay then.' And then he said if I ever needed a hand at his landscaping company on weekends, he could use someone reliable." Daniel paused. "The cousin I looked down on for years just offered me work, because I finally stopped pretending I was better than him." "That's grace," I said. "You gave him grace and he gave it back. That's how it's supposed to work. You never knew that before because you never needed it before." "I never needed anything before," Daniel said. "That was the whole problem. You can't be grateful for something you never needed." Now, I have to tell you about the day. Everything I thought I understood about this situation turned over on its head. Because up to this point, I'll be honest with you, I was the wise mother teaching the hard lesson, and Daniel was the fallen son learning it, and I'd gotten fairly comfortable in that arrangement. I'd told myself a clean story. And then about 4 months in, on an ordinary Tuesday, my accountant called me and blew the whole clean story to pieces. His name was Gerald, and he'd kept my books for 20 years, and he called me and said, "Evelyn, I need you to come in. There's something in the old files you need to see, and I don't want to tell you over the phone." So I went in, and Gerald sat me down, and he slid a folder across the desk, and it was old. The paper had gone yellow at the edges, and he said, "I was doing the deep archive cleanup we talked about, digitizing the old accounts, and I found the original trust documents from when you first set up the arrangement for Daniel. Do you remember signing these?" I opened the folder, and there was my own handwriting from 12 years ago, and there was a letter clipped to the front of it. A letter I had written and forgotten. A letter to myself, dated the day I set up the whole invisible machine that had funded my son's life. Gerald said, "Read the last paragraph." And I read it. And in my own hand, 12 years younger, I had written, "I am doing this because I love him, but I am afraid. I am afraid that if I ever tell him the truth, he will love me for who I am, only for what I have. So I will keep it secret, and I will tell myself it is for his character, when the truth is, it is for my own fear. God forgive me if I am doing him harm, but I would rather have his love built on a lie than risk losing it with the truth." I sat in Gerald's office, and I read my own confession from 12 years ago, and I understood something that dropped the floor out from under my whole clean story. I had told Daniel at my kitchen table that I'd hidden my wealth to build his character. That was the story I'd been telling everyone. That was the noble version. But here in my own handwriting was the real version, the one I'd forgotten because it was too ugly to keep remembering. I hadn't hidden the money to make him strong. I'd hidden it because I was afraid my own son would only love me for my money. I'd hidden it out of fear. My fear. Not his character. Mine. I had spent 4 months feeling like the wise mother administering hard medicine. And the truth was the whole rotten arrangement had started because I was just as afraid in my own way as Daniel was entitled. I raised a son who couldn't see me because I spent his whole childhood hiding, and I hid because I didn't trust him to love the real me. I'd made him into someone who valued money over people because deep down I'd been terrified that's exactly what he'd do if he knew, and so I never gave him the chance to prove otherwise. The apple, it turned out, had not fallen far from the tree. I just hadn't wanted to look at the tree. I drove home from Gerald's office, and I sat in my quiet little house, and for the first time in this whole story, I wasn't sure I'd been right. And that's a terrible thing to be 4 months and one wrecked marriage into a hard lesson, and to suddenly wonder if you were the one who needed teaching all along. I called Ruth. I read her the letter. And my sister, who is sharper than me and always has been, was quiet for a long moment, and then she said the thing I needed to hear even though I didn't want to. "Evie," she said, "you weren't wrong to let him fall, but you were wrong to think you were doing it clean. You've been up on that high horse of yours just like Daniel was up on his. Difference is his was made of money, and yours is made of being right. And a high horse is a high horse, sister, no matter what it's built of." "So what do?" I said. "Do I tell him? Do I tell him the whole thing was my fear, not his failing?" "You tell him the truth," Ruth said. "That's what you promised him, isn't it? Nothing but the truth from here on." "Well, here's some truth you didn't see coming. That's the thing about the truth, Evie. It doesn't just cut the people you aim it at." I sat with that for a week. I didn't tell Daniel right away because I was ashamed, and because I was afraid there it was. Again, the same fear, the family disease afraid. That if I admitted the whole thing had started with my own weakness, I'd lose the moral high ground, and if I lost that, what did I have left? And then I caught myself thinking exactly that, and I realized I was doing it again. Protecting my own comfort and calling it wisdom. Hiding the truth to manage how my son saw me. So I called him. And I said, "Daniel, I need to tell you something, and it's going to change how you see everything I've said to you these past 4 months. Can you come by?" He came that evening straight from the hardware store, still in the store's polo shirt with paint on his hands, and he sat down at my kitchen table. His spot now, I'd started to think of it as his spot, and I slid the yellow folder across to him the way Gerald had slid it to me. "Read the last paragraph," I said, and he read it. And I watched my son read my 12-year-old confession, and I watched him understand it, and I braced myself for anger, for the vindication of a man who'd just learned that his tormentor was a hypocrite, for him to throw it back in my face. "You did this out of fear. You have no right to lecture me about character. You're just as broken as I am." That's what the old Daniel would have done. That's what I would have deserved. But my son set the folder down, and he looked at me for a long moment, and then he got up, and he came around the table, and he knelt down next to my chair, so we were eye to eye, and he took my hand. "Mom," he said, "do you know what this means?" "It means I'm a hypocrite," I said, and my voice shook. "It means I did the same thing you did. I put fear ahead of love, and I dressed it up as something noble. It means I had no right." "No," Daniel said. "Stop. Listen to me. It means we're the same. Don't you see? For 4 months I've been sitting in that apartment thinking I was uniquely broken. That there was something wrong with me specifically, that I was some kind of monster who could look at his own mother and see a burden. I've been drowning in it. And this," he held up the folder, "this tells me I'm not a monster. I'm my mother's son. You were afraid to be loved for the wrong reasons, so you hid. I was raised inside that hiding, so I learned to love the wrong things. It's the same wound, Mom. You didn't give me your money, you gave me your fear, and that I can actually forgive. Because now it's not a sickness that's only in me. It's something we can fix together. I have raised this boy his whole life. I have loved him through every stage of it, and I am telling you that in 40 years, that was the first moment my son was ever wiser than me. I had come to that table to confess a weakness braced to lose his respect. And instead he took my confession and turned it into the first honest bridge between us in 30 years. He forgave me in the same breath he understood me. He did the thing I had never once managed to do for him. He loved me more in my weakness than he ever had in my strength. I put my arms around my son in my kitchen, both of us with tears running down, and I held on the way. He'd held on to me 4 months before, and I whispered, "When did you get so wise?" And he laughed, wet and broken and real, and he said, "About $9 an hour, 1 shift at a time." We stayed up until 2 in the morning that night, actually talking the way we never had, not once in his whole life. He told me about the shame of the early mornings at the hardware store, and I told him about the shame of the cannery. He told me about missing Lily so bad it felt like a broken bone, and I told him about the nights after Thomas died when I'd stand over his crib and cry because I didn't know how I'd do it. For the first time, I let my son see the woman who'd built the empire, not the wise oracle dispensing lessons, but the scared young widow who'd made 1,000 mistakes and gotten lucky and hidden all of it because she was terrified, just plain terrified of not being enough. "Why didn't you ever tell me any of this?" he asked. "Growing up, any of it. The struggle, the fear, the real you. If I'd known who you actually were. Because I thought a good mother protects her child from all of it," I said. The struggle and the fear and the mistakes. I thought if I let you see me scared, I'd be a burden to you. I spent your whole childhood making sure you never had to carry 1 ounce of my weight." I shook my head. "And I got it exactly backwards. Carrying a little of your mother's weight is how a child learns to carry his own. I never let you carry anything. So you grew up thinking weight was something other people handled for you." Daniel was quiet, and then he said something that I've thought about every day since. "You know what the cruelest part is," he said. "If you'd let me see you struggle even once, if you'd sat me down when I was 16 and said, 'Son, I'm scared, I'm tired. I built all this and I'm still afraid it'll all fall apart,' I'd have loved you more, not less. That's the thing you never trusted me with. You thought I'd love you less if I saw you weak. And the truth is, that's the only version of you I'd have known how to love right." And there it was, the whole thing. 30 years of hiding, and the tragedy was that the hiding was never necessary. He'd have loved the real me. He'd have loved her better. I never gave him the chance because I didn't trust him, and he grew up unable to love what he was never allowed to see. I want to leave you tonight, sitting in that kitchen with us at 2 in the morning, 4 months into the hardest winter of both our lives, finally telling each other the truth. Because I told you at the beginning that this was a story about a son who broke his mother's heart on Christmas, and it was. But I didn't know yet sitting there that it was also a story about a mother who'd broken her own son long before that, quietly and visibly, with the best intentions in the world, and called it love. We were both of us broken. We'd both of us been hiding. And that night, for the first time, we stopped. But understanding a wound and healing it are two different things. We had named it finally the sickness that ran through both of us. And naming a thing is powerful, but it doesn't undo it. Daniel still had a daughter 2,000 miles away. He still had a wife who'd left him an ex-wife, now the papers filed. He still made $9 an hour and lived over a laundromat. And I still had a company and a family watching, and a granddaughter I was terrified of losing to distance and time. The truth had brought us together at that kitchen table, but it hadn't fixed a single practical thing about the wreckage of my son's life. And as we finally said goodnight, and I watched him drive off in that same cheap rental he'd never traded up from, I realized that the hardest part of this whole story wasn't behind us at all, because now Daniel knew who he wanted to become. He'd found the bottom and he'd started to climb. But wanting to become someone and actually building the life to hold that person, those are two different mountains. And the second one I was about to learn was the one that would test everything both of us were truly made of. The second mountain announced itself on a Saturday morning in March, and it came of all things in the form of an abandoned building. Daniel had been picking up weekend work with his cousin Bill's landscaping crew, and one of the jobs took him to the east side of town to a stretch of blocks I'd known for 40 years because Harper Holdings owned 3 of the buildings on it and had for 2 decades and had done nothing with them but let them sit. Daniel didn't know that yet. He just knew he was clearing brush from an empty lot next to a derelict brick building with plywood over the windows, and that something about it stopped him cold. He called me that night, and there was a charge in his voice I hadn't heard in a long time. Not the fragile pride of the hardware store, but something bigger, something with fire in it. "Mom, there's a building over on Del Mar. Old brick 3-story. Been empty for years, and there's a whole family living in a car in the lot next to it. I talked to them. The dad lost his job, they lost their apartment, they've got 2 kids sleeping in a Honda Civic. And I'm standing there looking at this huge empty building 50 feet away, boarded up, rotting, doing nothing, and there's a family in a car, and I just..." He stopped. "It doesn't make sense. All that empty space and all those people with nowhere to go. Somebody should do something with buildings like that." I gripped the phone, because I knew that building. I knew it intimately, and I knew something Daniel didn't. "What would you do with it?" I asked. Careful, neutral. "I don't know. Fix it up. Turn it into apartments people could actually afford. Real rent, not the kind of numbers Claire and I used to throw around. Something a family in a Honda could climb into." He laughed, embarrassed. "Listen to me. I mix paint for a living and I'm talking like a developer. Forget it. It's a stupid idea." "It's not stupid," I said. And I made a decision in that moment that I want you to understand, because it was the opposite of every instinct I'd fought for 4 months. For 4 months, I had refused to hand my son anything. I'd let his marriage end, let him move over a laundromat, let him mix paint for $9 an hour, all because handing him things was the poison that had nearly killed him. And here was a chance to hand him the biggest thing yet, a building I already owned sitting empty, that would make his stupid idea real overnight. And I didn't do it. You should look into it, I said instead. Really look into it. Find out who owns it. Find out what it'd cost to buy to renovate. Find out what the city allows. Do the whole thing, Daniel, the way a real developer would. Don't guess. No. Mom, I can't buy a building. I have $400 in the bank. I didn't say buy it. I said learn it. There's a difference. You want to know if you're actually made for something, or if it's just a nice feeling you had standing in a lot. Do the work. Nobody's going to hand you this. Find out if it's real. There was a pause, and then my son said, okay, I'll do the work. And I could hear that I'd landed it right, that if I'd offered to help, he'd have taken the help and stayed small, but I'd offered him a mountain instead, and something in him wanted to climb. What I didn't tell him, what I sat on for the next 2 months, and Lord it was hard, was that the building on Delmar was mine. I owned it through a subsidiary buried 3 layers deep, and there was no earthly way Daniel would trace it back to me because I'd built those layers specifically so nobody ever could. I could have told him. I nearly did a dozen times, but I understood in a way I hadn't 4 months earlier that this was the final test of the very thing I'd broken in him. If I told him it was mine, if I handed him the building, I'd be right back to being the invisible hand that made his life work. And he'd never know if he'd earned it, or if his mother had once again quietly arranged the whole thing. So I said nothing. And I watched my son try to buy a building I already owned without either of us admitting it, and it was the strangest and hardest thing I have ever done as a mother. He threw himself into it. I want you to understand the size of what he took on. This was a man with no money, no credit worth speaking of anymore, working 2 jobs, driving to Arizona once a month to see his daughter, and in every spare hour he had left, he was teaching himself development from the ground up. He read zoning codes at the kitchen table in his apartment over the laundromat. He walked into the city planning office so many times the clerks knew him by name. He learned what a variance was, what a construction loan was, what it meant to put together a proposal that a bank or an investor would actually look at. And he failed. Over and over. At first he failed. The first bank laughed him out of the office. He told me about it, and he wasn't even angry, just stunned. The loan officer looked at my income and my divorce and my $400, and he actually smiled at me, Mom, like I was cute. Like a kid asking to buy a car with a jar of pennies. What did you do? I thanked him for his time, and I asked him what I'd need to bring back to not get laughed at. And he told me, and I wrote it all down. That was the moment I think that I knew something had truly taken root. The old Daniel would have raged at that loan officer, would have taken the humiliation and turned it into resentment, into the world's unfairness, into somebody else's fault. This Daniel wrote it down and asked how to do better. He was becoming a man who could be told no and hear it as information instead of insult. He found the ownership records, of course. That was a bad week for me. He called and said, so the building's owned by some company called Meridian Property Partners, and I've been trying to figure out who's actually behind it. And it's like an onion, Mom. It just keeps having more layers. Whoever owns it really doesn't want to be found. Maybe they have their reasons, I said, and my heart was going like a drum. Yeah, well, I sent them a letter anyway. A real one. Made an offer to buy, laid out my whole plan. Probably won't even get a response. But I figured a real developer sends the letter even when it's a long shot. That letter landed on my desk 11 days later, forwarded up through the layers by a property manager who had no idea the man who wrote it was my son. I sat in my office and I read it 3 times. It was good. It was genuinely good, earnest and specific and humble, laying out a vision for affordable units, acknowledging he was new and undercapitalized, asking not for a handout, but for a conversation. My son, who a year ago couldn't have told you what a variance was, had written a developer's letter to buy his own mother's building, and it was good enough that if a stranger had written it, I'd have taken the meeting. So I took the meeting. God help me, I took it. I had Harold set it up through Meridian with strict instructions that my name appear nowhere. Daniel was told only that a representative of the ownership group was willing to hear his proposal. He didn't know the representative would be me. And I sat in a rented conference room downtown on the far side of a long table, and I watched my son walk in wearing a suit. I recognized one of his old ones from the good days that he'd kept, and had pressed, carrying a folder of everything he'd taught himself over 2 months. "Thank you for seeing me," he said, and he shook my hand, his own mother's hand, and did not know it because the room was set up formal, and I'd positioned myself with the window behind me so the light was in his eyes, and because a man does not expect to find his mother on the other side of a business table, so he does not look for her there. And I let him make his whole pitch. I want you to sit with how hard that was. My son stood at the end of a conference table and pitched his heart out to a woman he didn't know was his mother, about a building he didn't know she owned, and I had to sit there with a poker face and pretend to be a stranger while he laid out the most honest, hardest-won work of his entire life. He talked about the family and the Honda. He talked about what he'd learned. He talked about affordable units and phased renovation, and how he'd keep costs down by doing demolition labor himself on weekends. He talked for 20 minutes, and he was nervous, and he was real, and he was so much better than the man who'd stood up at that Christmas table that I had to look down at my folder twice to keep my composure. When he finished, I asked him the hardest question I had. "Mr. Harper," I said, and it was strange beyond words to call my own son Mr. Harper. "Your proposal is well prepared, but I have to be direct. You have no capital, no development track record, and by your own account, you were until recently living a very different kind of life. Why should ownership take a risk on you specifically? What makes you qualified to do this?" And I watched my son's face, and I saw him decide in real time to tell the truth instead of the pitch. "I'm not qualified," he said. "Not on paper. You're right. A year ago, I was a man who thought he'd built his own success, and it turned out I hadn't built any of it. My mother had in secret my whole life, and I never knew, and I treated her," his voice caught, "I treated her like she was nothing, like she owed me. And I lost everything when the truth came out. My money, my marriage, the life I thought was mine, and I deserved to lose it. So no, I'm not qualified, but I'll tell you what I am." He leaned forward, both hands flat on the table, and I saw my own posture in him, the exact way I stand when I mean something all the way down. I'm a man who found out the hard way what it costs when somebody has nothing and everybody looks away. I spent 40 years being the person who looked away. I'm not that person anymore. And there's a family sleeping in a car next to that building right now, and I know exactly how invisible they feel, because for 4 months I've been invisible too. That's not on my resume, but it's the only qualification that actually matters for this. The room was quiet, and I sat there on the far side of that table, and I understood that my son had just passed a test I hadn't even known I was giving him, because I'd asked him why he deserved it, and instead of selling me on his worthiness, he'd told me the truth about his unworthiness. He'd stopped performing. The man who'd stood at the Christmas table performing success for 22 relatives was gone, and in his place was a man who could sit across from money and power and simply tell the truth, even when the truth cost him the pitch. I had to end the meeting quickly after that because I was about to lose my composure entirely. I told him ownership would consider his proposal and be in touch. He thanked me, shook my hand again, and left. And I sat alone in that rented conference room, and I put my face in my hands and I wept because I had just watched my son become in front of my eyes, the man I'd spent his whole life praying he would be, and he'd done it without me. He'd done it in the winter I'd finally had the courage to let reach him. Now here is where the story turned in a way I did not plan and did not control. I went home that night intending to have Harold approve the sale. I'd carry the fiction a while longer, sell Daniel the building through Meridian at a fair price with terms he could manage, and let him build his dream, not knowing his mother owned the ground it stood on. That was my plan. It was a good plan. It kept my hands invisible, which is what I decided the whole lesson required. But I couldn't sleep. And around 2 in the morning I understood why, and it stopped me cold in my own kitchen. I was about to do it again. I was about to secretly arrange my son's success from behind a curtain, tell myself it was for his own good, and hide my hand so completely that he'd never know. It was the exact same thing I'd done for 30 years. The exact same fear, wearing a new and nobler-looking coat. I'd learned to stop handing him money. I hadn't learned to stop hiding. And Gerald's yellow folder came back to me, my own confession in my own hand. I would rather have his love built on a lie than risk losing it with the truth. And I realized that if I sold my son that building in secret, I would be building his whole new life on the very same lie that had poisoned the old one. I'd have done it all again, better disguised, but the same. So the next morning I called Daniel and I asked him to come to my house. And when he sat down at his spot at my kitchen table, I put a folder in front of him, not Gerald's yellow one, a new one. And inside it were the ownership records for the building on Del Mar, traced all the way down through every layer of the onion, all the way to the bottom, to me. I watched him open it. I watched him read it. I watched him get to the last page, to the name at the center of all those layers, and I watched him understand. "Meridian is you," he said slowly. The building's yours. You've owned it the whole time." He looked up, and I braced for the anger, for the betrayal. "For you set me up, you let me pitch to you, you humiliated me. The representative yesterday, the meeting, that was—" His face changed. "That was you. I pitched to you. I sat there and told you I treated my mother like she was nothing, and it was you the whole time." "It was me," I said. "And Daniel, I need you to hear why I'm telling you now when I never had to, when I could have sold it to you clean and you'd never have known." "Why?" And it wasn't angry. It was cracked open, bewildered. "Why would you set that whole thing up? Why put me through that?" "I didn't set it up as a test," I said. "That's the thing. I set it up because I was doing what I always do, hiding my hand, arranging your life from behind a curtain, telling myself it was for your own good. I was going to sell you this building in secret and let you build your dream on top of a lie, the exact same lie I built your whole childhood on. And last night I couldn't sleep because I finally saw myself doing it. 30 years I did it, and I almost did it one more time." I reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm telling you the truth now because I promised you nothing but the truth, and because I finally understand that hiding my help was never love. It was always fear, and I'm done. So here it is, all of it in the open. This building is mine, and I'm not going to give it to you." He blinked. "You're not—" "No, because a gift would poison it the same way every gift I ever gave you got poisoned. But I'm not going to hide it from you either. Here's what I'm going to do instead in the full light of day, where you can see every part of it." I took a breath because I'd worked this out at 4 a.m, and I needed to get it right. "I'm going to sell you this building at full market price, on a real loan with real terms that you'll pay back out of real revenue, and if the project fails, you'll lose it the same as any developer would. I'm not going to make it easy. I'm going to make it possible. That's the only kind of help I have any business giving you anymore, the kind you can see and the kind you can fail at." Daniel stared at me, and then slowly he started to laugh, not bitter, not broken, but something clear and astonished. "You're going to be my lender," he said. "You're going to make me pay you back, market rate, and if I screw it up, I lose it." "Every penny," I said, "with interest, and I'll hold you to it harder than any bank would because I know exactly what you're capable of, so I won't let you give me less." "That's the least motherly thing I've ever heard," he said, wiping his eyes, still laughing. "Making your own son take out a full-price loan." "No," I said, and I felt the truth of it settle into my bones as I said it. "It's the most motherly thing I've ever done. For 30 years I gave you everything, and it made you into someone I didn't recognize. This is the first time I've ever loved you enough to let you earn something instead of handing it to you. This is what love was supposed to look like the whole time. I just never had the courage for it until now." And my son got up from his spot at my kitchen table, and he came around and he knelt down beside my chair, the way he had once before, and he said, "Then let's do it right, all of it, out in the open. I'll sign whatever a stranger would sign. And Mom," his voice went rough, "thank you for not hiding it. Thank you for finally letting me see you. That's worth more than the building. You know that, right? You letting me see the whole thing, even the part that makes you look afraid, that's the best thing you've ever given me. We built it out in the open after that, and I want you to know that it was not easy, and I did not make it easy, and that was the whole point." Daniel signed a real loan at a real rate. He put his own labor into that building weekends and evenings, swinging a hammer alongside the crew, learning construction from the men who'd worked for Harper Holdings for years. Men who had no idea the exhausted 40-year-old carrying drywall up 3 flights was the owner's son, because I didn't tell them, and neither did he, because he wanted to be judged by his work and nothing else. There were nights he called me ready to quit. The permitting fell through twice. A contractor walked off the job. He found asbestos in a wall that ate 2 months of budget he didn't have, and he had to go back to the bank, the real bank now, because he'd built enough of a track record to get real financing and restructure the whole thing, and he did it, and it aged him. I could see it aging him, but it was aging him into someone. Every hard thing that would have broken the man at the Christmas table was building the man in front of me now. And the family in the Honda. He never forgot them. When the first units were livable months later, that family was the first he moved in, the father back on his feet by then, working able to pay the modest rent Daniel had built the whole project around. Daniel told me about handing them the keys, and he said, "Mom." The dad shook my hand and he couldn't talk. He just held on to my hand and he couldn't get any words out. And I knew exactly what he was feeling because that's how I felt at your kitchen table when you told me you weren't leaving. That feeling of somebody sees me, somebody didn't look away. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, you gave him what you needed most. That's what the winter was for Daniel, not to punish you, to teach you what people need by making you need it yourself. But the moment that undid me completely, the one I'll carry to my grave, came near the end of that long year, and it didn't have anything to do with buildings or money at all. Claire called me, out of nowhere from Arizona, and I braced for a fight because Claire and I had never had a kind word. But that's not what it was. Evelyn, she said, and she sounded different, humbled somehow. I need to tell you something. Lily's been talking about her dad. Every phone call, she tells me he shows up. Every single visit, every call he's there, he's never late, he's never distracted. And I've been watching him on these video calls, and he's not the man I left. The man I left would have disappeared when the money did. He'd have felt sorry for himself and vanished. And this man just keeps showing up for his daughter with nothing, no money, no reason except that he loves her. She paused. I left because I thought he was going to be nothing. And I was wrong. He became something I didn't even know he had in him. And I don't think that happened by accident. I think you did that. So I'm calling to say thank you, and to say I'm sorry for the things I said about you the day I left. I had to sit down, because this was the woman who'd told my son that I'd taken everything and she wasn't going to be poor while he learned to be a man. And here she was a year later telling me the winter had worked, not just on Daniel, on how the whole world saw Daniel. You didn't do anything wrong, Claire, I said. You wanted a certain kind of life. Most people do. There's no crime in it. Maybe, she said. But I want you to know something. Lily asked me last week if we could move back, to be closer to her dad, and I told her I'd think about it. And Evelyn, I am thinking about it. Not because of money, there's no money now, I know that, but because my daughter deserves to grow up near the man her father turned into. And so do I, honestly. I'd rather have a version of him near her than a version of him that never existed near me. I got off that phone and I sat in my kitchen and I cried for the second time in this whole long story, but these were different tears entirely, because I had gambled everything: my son's comfort, his marriage, my relationship with him, my own certainty that I was doing right on the idea that there was a real man buried under all that softness I'd created. And I'd been right. He was in there. He'd been in there the whole time. He just needed the whole false structure to collapse before he could stand up on his own 2 feet. That night I called Daniel and told him about Claire's call, and there was a long silence on the line, and then he said in a voice I'd never heard from him, thick and disbelieving, "She wants to come back. She's thinking about it, for Lily, and maybe for you. Don't rush it and don't get your hopes up too high, and don't you dare change one thing about who you've become to try to win her back. If she comes back to the man you actually are now, not 1 inch of pretending. You hear me?" "I hear you," he said, and then quiet. "A year ago I'd have thrown money at getting her back, chartered a plane, bought her something huge, and it wouldn't have meant anything." A breath. "Now all I've got to offer her is who I am, and it turns out that's the only thing that was ever worth anything." "Now you know," I said softly. "Now you finally know." And as I hung up the phone that night in my quiet little house that nobody in the family had ever seen, I let myself feel something I hadn't let myself feel since that cold Christmas night when my son told me to pay rent or leave. I let myself feel hope. Real hope, the earned kind, the kind that costs something. Because the boy I thought I'd lost at that dinner table wasn't lost at all. He'd just been buried alive under 30 years of my fear, and it had taken burning the whole thing down to dig him back out. And standing there in the wreckage, blinking in the light, was the man I'd promised his father over a crib 30 years ago that I would raise. I'd kept the promise, just not at all the way I'd planned, and not without breaking both our hearts to do it. Claire and Lily came back in the fall, not to Daniel. I want to be clear about that because this isn't the kind of story where everything snaps neatly back into the shape it had before. Claire didn't move back into a marriage. She moved back into the same city, into an apartment of her own, 20 minutes from Daniel's, and she and my son began the slow, careful work of becoming something new. Co-parents first, friends cautiously after that. And then over months I watched from a respectful distance, something that started to look like 2 grown people falling for each other all over again. Except this time she was falling for a man who actually existed, instead of the projection she'd married the first time. The day Lily came back, my granddaughter ran into my arms at the airport, the exact same way she had run out of them nearly 2 years before, except now she was almost 8 taller with new front teeth and a gap-toothed grin, and she wrapped her arms around my neck and said into my ear, "Grandma, Daddy has a whole building. Did you know that he builds houses for people who don't have any?" "I did know that," I said, holding her so tight. "I know a little something about that building, baby." "He let me paint a door," she said, pulling back eyes enormous. "A real door, in a real apartment, and a real family lives behind it now, and my paint is on their door." And I looked over her head at my son standing there watching his daughter tell his mother about the door, and there were tears standing in his eyes, and I understood that this ordinary moment at an airport, a little girl bragging about a painted door, was worth more than every dollar Harper Holdings had ever made. All of it. 30 years of quiet empire building, and it had never once given me what that painted door gave me. The business grew. I'm not going to pretend the money stopped mattering because it didn't, and Daniel would be the first to tell you that a mission without a working budget is just a wish. That first building on Del Mar filled up every unit families who'd been one bad month from the street. Now behind doors, they could afford some of them painted by an 8-year-old. And Daniel paid me back. Every month on time at the rate we'd agreed, and I never once forgave a payment or softened a term, and he never once asked me to. The day he made the final payment on that loan, he drove to my house and sat down at his spot at my kitchen table and put the last check in front of me, and neither one of us said anything for a long moment. "Paid in full," he finally said. "I own it, for real. Not because you gave it to me, because I earned it, and I paid for it, and it's mine." "It's yours," I agreed, and I picked up that check and I looked at it, and then I did something I'd planned for weeks. I tore it in half. Daniel's eyes went wide. "Mom, not because you didn't earn it," I said quickly, before he could think it was the old poison coming back. "You earned every penny, and I want you to always know you earned it. But you've made your last payment, and you've proven everything to me and to yourself that ever needed proving, and now I get to do the one thing a mother is actually allowed to do, which is give her son a gift in the open, with both of us knowing exactly what it is. Not a lie, not a hidden hand, a gift, freely given, freely received, with nothing hidden underneath it. That's different from what I used to do. Do you see the difference?" And he did. That was the whole point of the 2 hardest years of both our lives right there, that my son could now tell the difference between a gift that lifts you up and a gift that keeps you small. He came around the table and he hugged me and he said, "I see the difference. I'll always see it now. You made sure of that." We went into business together after that, really together as partners out in the open, my name and his on the same documents where anyone could read them. Harper Holdings had spent 20 years sitting on empty buildings, treating them as assets on a balance sheet. And Daniel walked into my boardroom one afternoon, invited this time expected, and he pitched the board on turning those dead assets into affordable housing across the whole East Side. And this time, when the investors asked him why he cared so much, he didn't hide anything. "Because I spent 40 years living in comfort, I didn't earn and didn't understand," he told a room full of people in expensive suits, and it took losing all of it to find out what people actually need. And what they need isn't charity. It's a door with their name behind it, and a rent they can actually pay, and somebody who doesn't look away. I know that because for a while, I was the one who needed it. My mother built this company from $11,000 and a dead husband's insurance, and she did it so that I'd never have to struggle. And the greatest thing she ever did for me was to finally let me struggle anyway. I'm standing here because she loved me enough to stop protecting me. Now let's go build something worth her name. The board approved it. Not because he was my son. I made them vote before I said a single word, and I abstained, and I told them so. They approved it because it was good, and because he was good, and because the man making the pitch had earned every eye in that room. I want to tell you about my sister Ruth, because she saw all of this from the beginning, from that Christmas table, and she said something to me near the end of that second year that I've never forgotten. We were sitting on my porch, 2 old women watching the light go down, and she said, "You know, Evie, when you drove off from that dinner, I thought you'd lost him for good. I thought that was the end of your family. I've never in my life been so glad to be wrong." "There were nights I thought so too," I admitted. "What made you so sure?" she asked. "All those months when he was drowning, when Claire left, when it looked like you'd just blown up your only child's life for a principle, what made you keep going?" And I thought about it a long time before I answered, because she deserved a real answer. I wasn't sure, I said finally. That's the thing nobody tells you about love, Ruth. The hardest kind of love isn't the kind where you know it'll work out. It's the kind where you do the right thing, not knowing if you'll lose everything for it. I didn't know Daniel would come back. I gambled that he would. But if he hadn't, if he'd hated me forever, if he'd never dug his way out, I'd still have had to do it. Because the alternative was watching him stay a man who could evict his own mother on Christmas and feel righteous about it. And I'd rather lose a son to the truth than keep one built on a lie. I reached over and squeezed her hand. But God, I'm glad I didn't have to find out what losing him felt like. I'm so glad, Ruth. There's one more thing I have to tell you, and it's the thing that closes this whole circle, and I've been holding on to it because it's the part that matters most. 2 years to the day after that Christmas, the same date I planned it that way, I hosted Christmas dinner again. Not in the big house. That house had been sold, another family living in it now, and Daniel had never once asked for it back, which told me everything. I hosted it in my quiet little house, the one nobody in the family had ever seen, the real one. And I opened the doors, and I let them all in, Ruth and Margaret and Bill and the cousins, all 20-some of them, the same people who'd watched my son tell me to pay rent or leave 2 years before. They came into my real home for the first time, and they saw who I actually was, finally all of it out in the open. And Daniel stood up at that table, the same way he had 2 years before. He tapped his glass with his fork, ting, 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 and the table went quiet, and I felt my heart clench for just a second out of pure memory, pure reflex, because the last time he stood up and did that, it broke my life in half. But this time, my son looked around the table, and then he looked at me and he said, 2 years ago at this same dinner I stood up and I told my mother to pay rent or get out of my house. He let that sit. Nobody moved. Except it was never my house. It was hers. Everything was hers. The house, the car, the career I bragged about, the whole life I thought I'd built. She built it in secret for 30 years, and I repaid her by trying to evict her from her own home in front of all of you. That's who I was 2 years ago. I want to say it out loud in front of the same people who watched it happen, because I spent 40 years hiding from the truth, and I'm done hiding. Lily, sitting beside him, reached up and took his hand. My mother could have let me keep believing the lie, Daniel went on, and his voice was thick now. She could have paid the rent and kept quiet and let me go on being the man I was. It would have been easier. It would have kept the peace. But she loved me too much for easy, so she took it all away. She let me lose my house, my money, my marriage, everything I thought made me who I was. And standing in the wreckage of all of it with nothing, I finally found out who I actually was underneath. And it turned out I was her son after all. I just had to lose everything she gave me to become the man she raised. He lifted his glass, and he looked at me down the length of that table in my real house, surrounded by the family that had watched the whole thing, and he said, "To my mother, who didn't abandon me when she let me fall, who saved me. Everything I have I owe to the day she finally stopped giving me things and started giving me the truth. I love you, Mom, and I'm not ashamed anymore to say that everything I am I owe to you, because now finally it's true." The whole table was crying. Ruth was openly sobbing into her napkin. Even Bill, who'd needled Daniel so cruelly when he was down, had his hand over his mouth. And I stood up, 69 years old now, my knees worse than ever, and I lifted my own glass, and I looked at my son, this man, this good man that I had almost lost, that I had nearly loved into ruin, and then had the courage to love into truth, and I said the only thing left in my heart to say. 2 years ago you told me to pay rent or leave, I said, and I told you it was time you learned who owned this house. I was wrong about one thing, Daniel. I thought I owned everything, the house, the cars, the company, all of it, but I was wrong. My voice broke, and I let it, because there was nothing left to hide from anyone in that room. I never owned the only thing that ever mattered. I never owned you, your heart, your character, the man you'd choose to become. That was always yours. And when everything else was stripped away, you chose to become someone I am prouder of than any building, any dollar, anything I ever built in 30 years. You are the only thing I ever made that matters, and you made yourself. I raised my glass higher. So here's what I know now at 69 that I didn't know at 67. Real love isn't giving your child everything they want. I tried that for 30 years, and it nearly destroyed us both. Real love is having the courage to let them face the thing you've spent your whole life protecting them from, and trusting that who they truly are will be strong enough to survive it. I trusted that about you, and you proved me right. "Merry Christmas, son. Welcome home." We drank. And then my grandbaby Lily, almost 8 years old, stood up on her chair without asking anyone and raised her cup of apple juice high over her head and shouted, "Merry Christmas to Grandma's house, the real one." And the whole table roared, laughing and crying at the same time, and I gathered that child into my arms and held her, and I looked around at my family whole again, truer than it had ever been sitting in my real home with nothing hidden anymore. And I understood that I had gotten at the very end of a long and frightened life, the one thing all my money had never been able to buy. I had gotten my son back, the real one, and he had gotten me back, the real me, and neither one of us was hiding from the other ever again. That is the whole truth of it. I spent 30 years believing that love meant protecting my son from every hard thing in the world. I was wrong. Love was never the shield I put between him and the cold. Love was the moment I finally had the courage to lower it and let him feel the winter and trust that the man I'd raised would know how to build his own fire. He did. He built one big enough to warm a whole community. And it took me 67 years and one terrible Christmas to learn the hardest lesson a parent can ever learn, that sometimes the most loving thing you will ever do for your child is to stop saving them and let them save themselves. My name is Evelyn Harper. I built a company worth more money than I could ever spend. But the greatest thing I ever built was the courage at the very end to tell my son the truth. And that truth didn't cost me my family. It gave it back to me.